The auction notice was taped crooked beside the coffee machine at Miller Feed and Grain 3 days before Thanksgiving. Most people barely looked at it. The Harper family farm had been sold quietly to a regional development company out of Des Moines, signed over by Grandpa Walter's 3 sons while he recovered from pneumonia in a county care facility. 800 acres gone in one afternoon. The brothers called it unavoidable. Taxes. Debt. Age. Progress. But when Walter returned home and saw the survey stakes pushed into the frozen pasture, he asked only one question at the dinner table. Did they use the 1974 signature? Nobody answered. Walter Harper returned to the farm under a gray Iowa sky that looked permanently exhausted. Snowmelt dripped from the machine shed roof in slow intervals, tapping the rusted fuel drum beside the barn like a metronome. His grandson Eli drove him home from the county facility in silence except for the heater rattling against the windshield vents. Walter carried only a wool coat, a dented thermos, and a yellow legal notebook held together with masking tape. The Harper farm sat differently now. Bright orange survey flags had appeared along the western field. Fresh tire tracks crossed the soybean ground near the creek. Someone had hammered temporary boundary markers beside the access road. The land already looked spoken for. Inside the farmhouse, Walter noticed small absences first. Filing cabinet slightly open. The hallway closet rearranged. A missing key from the kitchen pegboard. His sons had cleaned too carefully. At dinner, the atmosphere felt procedural rather than emotional. Richard, the eldest son, handled most of the talking. He explained the sale the way a banker explains late fees. Property taxes doubled in 6 years. We couldn't keep borrowing against acreage. Prairie Meridian Development offered cash. Walter listened while spooning soup slowly. Steam rose into his glasses. He never interrupted. His middle son, Dean, avoided eye contact completely. The youngest, Carl, kept folding his napkin into smaller and smaller squares. Then Walter asked the question. Did they use the 1974 signature? Silence settled over the table instantly. Eli looked between them. Richard finally answered. The attorney handled all the ownership paperwork. That wasn't my question, Walter said quietly. No one responded after that. Later that night, Walter walked alone into the basement carrying the old thermos. He switched on the hanging bulb above a row of metal filing cabinets coated in furnace dust. One drawer had fresh scratches near the lock. He opened it carefully. Empty folders. Missing ledgers. Removed survey maps. But one thing remained untouched, a narrow envelope hidden beneath the cabinet liner itself. Walter stared at it for a long moment before sliding it into his coat pocket. Upstairs, Eli heard the tea kettle whistle around midnight. He found Walter sitting at the kitchen table with county plats spread beside him, reading through old folded documents under a green banker's lamp. What is the 1974 signature? Eli asked. Walter kept reading. Something your uncles should have remembered. Outside, snow began covering the survey stakes 1 inch at a time. The next morning began with the sound of the courthouse clock striking 8 through freezing fog. Walter left before sunrise wearing the same brown coat and carrying the yellow notebook beneath his arm. Eli followed in the pickup without being asked. The roads were wet with half-melted snow, and the windshield wipers dragged slowly across salt residue while old AM radio static filled the cab. Neither of them spoke much. The Jasper County Records building sat beside the courthouse square like a forgotten brick warehouse from another decade. Inside, the heat barely worked. A woman at the front desk recognized Walter immediately but looked surprised to see him walking without assistance. "You're out early," she said. Walter nodded once. "Need the agricultural transfers from 73 through 75. She hesitated. "Those are archived downstairs." "I know where." The basement smelled like paper glue, mildew, and radiator steam. Rows of steel shelves disappeared into dim yellow light. Eli watched his grandfather move through the aisles with unsettling certainty, as if he remembered every drawer by instinct rather than memory. Walter stopped beside cabinet 14C. He opened a drawer labeled agricultural easements. Then another labeled family land trusts. Finally, he pulled out a thick binder wrapped in fading red cloth tape. Inside were photocopies of surveys, lending agreements, drainage maps, mineral right filings, and handwritten amendments dating back decades. Walter flipped through them slowly while Eli noticed something strange. Every important page carried two signatures. One from Walter. And another from his late wife, Rose. Except after 1974. After that year, only Walter's signature appeared. Eli frowned. Why? Walter slid a folded document across the table. At the top, stamped in blue ink, were the words. Family Agricultural Preservation Addendum, 1974. Beneath it sat a county seal and 3 witness signatures from a long-defunct law office. Walter tapped one paragraph with his finger. No transfer, development conversion, or structural rezoning of Harper agricultural holdings may occur without direct authorization from the original surviving grantor. Eli read it twice. Grantor means you. Walter nodded. The boys thought the ownership shares gave them authority to sell acreage. They forgot this stayed attached to the original deed. Then the sale isn't legal. Walter closed the folder carefully. The sale's real. Problem is the development company already borrowed against it. Outside the archive room, someone stopped walking. Walter noticed immediately. A shadow lingered beneath the frosted glass window. Then footsteps moved away quickly. By noon, Prairie Meridian Development had already heard Walter visited county records. The first phone call arrived before they reached home. Richard answered in the kitchen while pacing near the sink. They're asking whether Dad's contesting the transfer. Walter sat silently at the table, pouring coffee into a chipped white mug. Richard lowered his voice. Dad, what exactly are you doing? Walter unfolded an old county survey map across the table. Pinned in red pencil beside the western pasture sat a notation from 1978. Utility corridor reserved, authorization incomplete. Walter looked up calmly. I'm checking how many mistakes were made. That evening, Eli noticed something for the first time. His grandfather wasn't angry. He was organizing. And somewhere far away, inside a corporate office tower, someone had started calculating risk. By Friday, Prairie Meridian Development had installed temporary fencing along the western access road. Trucks arrived before dawn carrying drilling equipment, portable office trailers, and men in reflective jackets who never looked toward the farmhouse. The company moved with the confidence of people who believed paperwork mattered more than memory. Walter watched them from the kitchen window while the tea kettle rattled softly behind him. Eli noticed the notebook again. The yellow legal pad never left Walter's reach now. Every page contained dates, weather notes, acreage figures, signatures, county references, and names written in precise block letters. Some entries stretched back 40 years. Others had been added only hours earlier. What exactly are you writing down? Eli asked. Walter sipped coffee before answering. Anything people assume gets forgotten. That afternoon, Walter walked into the basement carrying a flashlight and a screwdriver. Eli followed carefully past shelves of canning jars, rusted tools, and old seed catalogs stacked in collapsing boxes. Near the furnace, Walter knelt beside a section of wooden paneling blackened by decades of heat. He removed 4 screws slowly. Behind the panel sat a narrow metal lockbox wrapped in wax paper. Eli stared. You hid that here? Walter ignored the question and carried the box upstairs. Snow tapped softly against the kitchen windows while he unlocked it with a brass key from his coat pocket. Inside were 3 items. A spiral notebook. A folded survey map. And a cassette tape labeled simply. April 1978, County Meeting. Walter opened the notebook first. Every page documented meetings between Harper family representatives, county zoning officials, and a utility contractor that had attempted to run a commercial water line beneath the western acreage decades earlier. One handwritten sentence had been underlined twice. Access rights never finalized. Eli looked confused. What does that mean? It means Prairie Meridian can't build what they promised investors. Walter spread the survey map across the table. A blue line crossed directly beneath the western field, the same land sold for commercial expansion. According to the old county markings, utility access depended on a permanent agricultural compliance agreement tied to the original Harper deed. The same deed protected by Walter's surviving authorization clause. Everything connected. The room stayed quiet for almost a minute. Then Richard's truck pulled violently into the driveway. He entered without removing his boots. "You contacted county zoning," he demanded. Walter remained seated. Richard threw a stack of papers onto the table. "Prairie Meridian suspended excavation this morning. They're claiming unresolved compliance exposure." Walter glanced at the documents but said nothing. Richard's breathing grew heavier. "Do you understand what happens if this deal collapses? They'll sue everybody involved." "You already sold something incomplete," Walter replied calmly. "You hid this from us." Walter looked at him for the first time directly. "No. I preserved it." Richard's anger faltered slightly under the silence that followed. Then Walter slid the cassette tape across the table. "County Meeting, April 1978, he said. "Might help refresh your memory about what your mother insisted be added." Richard didn't touch it. But his face changed. Just enough for Eli to understand something important. Richard already knew the agreement existed. He had simply believed nobody else could prove it anymore. Outside, one of Prairie Meridian's drilling rigs shut down completely. And for the first time since the sale, the construction site went quiet. The first lawyer arrived Monday morning in a black SUV coated with highway salt. He wore an expensive charcoal overcoat and shoes too clean for rural gravel. Eli watched from the porch as the man stepped carefully around frozen mud puddles and approached the farmhouse carrying a leather briefcase against his chest like something fragile. Walter kept drinking coffee at the kitchen table. The tea kettle hummed softly on the stove. Richard stood near the hallway, restless and pale from lack of sleep. Since Friday, Prairie Meridian had frozen all development activity across the western acreage. County zoning officials now demanded historical compliance verification before any utility permits could move forward. Investors were asking questions. Loan officers were reviewing filings. Somebody inside Prairie Meridian had realized the land itself might not legally support the project they already announced publicly. The lawyer introduced himself as Martin Keller from Des Moines. "We're hoping to resolve misunderstandings before this becomes unnecessarily expensive." Walter motioned toward the empty chair across from him. Keller opened a folder immediately. Inside sat freshly printed settlement drafts held together with neat binder clips. Prairie Meridian offered Walter a private compensation package in exchange for signing updated authorization documents retroactively validating the sale. Walter never touched the papers. Keller continued carefully. "The company is prepared to offer continued residence rights on the property and substantial financial consideration." "How substantial?" Walter asked. Relief crossed Keller's face. "Finally, movement. $400,000. Walter stirred cream into his coffee slowly. "That's lower than the tax incentives they already promised the county." The lawyer stopped speaking. Eli noticed it immediately. Walter had guessed correctly. Keller adjusted his tie. "You've clearly done research." Walter opened the yellow notebook. "No," he said quietly. "I kept records." Then he slid a photocopy across the table. "Utility access denied, pending grantor authorization." Stamped 1979. Keller read the document twice. The room lost warmth almost instantly. What exactly do you want, Mr. Harper? Walter looked toward the western fields outside the frosted window. Depends how much damage your company already caused. By afternoon, a second SUV arrived. Then a third. Prairie Meridian representatives spent hours inside the farmhouse reviewing old plats, surveys, easement maps, and archived county minutes Walter had preserved for decades. Every missing piece they needed already existed inside carefully labeled folders stacked beside the kitchen wall. The leverage kept growing. One executive quietly asked whether environmental reviews had been submitted before excavation. Walter answered without emotion. They drilled near protected runoff ground Saturday morning. The executive slowly closed his folder. Another mistake. Another exposure. That evening, Eli found Walter alone in the barn repairing a loose chain on an old grain elevator motor. Snow blew through cracks in the wooden siding while distant headlights from parked corporate vehicles glowed across the fields. You knew this would happen someday? Eli asked. Walter kept working. Your grandmother did. He tightened the wrench carefully. She made me document everything after the county tried pushing utility access through back in '78. Said someday somebody with money would forget the land belonged to people first. Eli leaned against the workbench quietly. So this was a trap. Walter shook his head once. No. He looked toward the dark western pasture. It was a boundary. That night, Prairie Meridian increased the settlement offer to $1.8 million. Walter still refused to sign anything. And somewhere inside a Des Moines boardroom, executives finally began discussing the possibility that the Harper farm had never legally belonged to them at all. Snow covered the western pasture completely by Wednesday morning. Prairie Meridian's equipment sat motionless beneath thin sheets of ice while county inspectors moved slowly across the property with clipboards tucked under their coats. Nobody drilled anymore. Nobody measured. The entire project had entered suspension pending legal review. Inside the farmhouse, the telephone rang constantly. Law firms. County offices. Insurance investigators. By now, Prairie Meridian understood the danger clearly. Their investors had financed infrastructure projections tied to land access that might never legally exist. Worse, internal filings showed the company had already leveraged future construction contracts against the Harper acreage before resolving historical compliance restrictions. They had moved too fast. Walter remained patient. Every morning followed the same routine: coffee before sunrise, handwritten notes in the yellow notebook, quiet review of old records beneath the green banker's lamp. Eli noticed his grandfather never appeared excited by the pressure building around them. If anything, Walter became calmer as the situation worsened. Because the outcome had stopped depending on emotion. Now it depended on paperwork. Late Wednesday afternoon, Martin Keller returned carrying another settlement proposal. This time, he arrived alone. No polished confidence remained. We need final clarification regarding the county meeting in April 1978, he said carefully. Walter nodded toward the cassette recorder sitting beside the lamp. You can listen. The tape player clicked softly before filling the kitchen with static and distant voices. Chairs scraped. Papers shuffled. Then a younger Walter spoke briefly about water access routes across agricultural land. But another voice quickly took control. Rose Harper. Her tone remained calm, direct, impossible to interrupt. No permanent utility corridor will exist unless surviving grantor authority remains attached to the original deed. Silence followed on the tape. Then a county official asked why. Rose answered immediately. Because companies change names faster than farms change soil. Keller lowered his eyes. The tape continued another 2 minutes before ending with the sound of signatures being witnessed and recorded. Click. Silence returned to the kitchen. Walter poured coffee into a second mug without asking whether Keller wanted any. Finally, the lawyer spoke. The company didn't know these records survived. Walter slid the old spiral notebook across the table. That's because people stopped valuing paper once computers arrived. Keller looked exhausted now. Prairie Meridian's prepared to dissolve the acquisition entirely. Eli looked up sharply. The lawyer continued. Full land reversion. Legal fees covered. Additional compensation for damages and improper excavation. Walter said nothing. Keller opened a final folder. Inside sat a figure handwritten in blue ink. $6.4 million. Even Eli stopped breathing for a moment. But Walter barely reacted. Instead, he opened the notebook to a page dated October 12, 1981. What happened that year? Eli asked quietly. Walter pointed toward a single sentence written beside an old rainfall entry. Richard attended county meeting without permission. Keller noticed it too. Walter finally looked toward the staircase where Richard had been silently listening from the shadows the entire time. You knew your mother protected this land, Walter said calmly. Richard's face collapsed slowly under the weight of it. Not greed. Shame. I thought selling was the only way left, he admitted quietly. Walter studied him for a long moment. Then he closed the notebook. Outside, county officials began removing Prairie Meridian's temporary survey stakes from the frozen pasture one by one. The final agreement was signed 2 weeks before Christmas inside a small conference room above the Jasper County Courthouse. No reporters attended. No cameras waited outside. Prairie Meridian wanted the matter concluded quietly, and Walter preferred it that way. Snow drifted against the courthouse windows while space heaters rattled near the walls. The room smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. Prairie Meridian's executives sat along one side of the table beside their attorneys and insurance representatives. Across from them sat Walter, Eli, and a county clerk organizing deed amendments into neat stacks. Richard arrived last, carrying a cardboard archive box filled with family records retrieved from his garage after days of searching. Nobody spoke much. By now, every person in the room understood the same thing. The Harper farm had nearly disappeared because several people assumed old paper no longer mattered. The settlement terms moved slowly through formal review. Prairie Meridian agreed to dissolve the acquisition entirely, surrender all development claims, fund environmental restoration on the western acreage, and pay financial damages through a confidential civil resolution that avoided public litigation. But one condition surprised everyone. Walter insisted the original 1974 preservation addendum remain permanently attached to the deed. One executive finally asked the question directly. After everything this clause caused, why keep it? Walter folded his glasses carefully before answering. Because someday another company will arrive convinced patience is weakness. Silence settled across the table again. The county clerk slid the final signature page forward. Walter signed first. His handwriting looked steady despite the arthritis in his hands. Then Richard signed beside him, slower than everyone else. When he finished, he stared at the paper for several seconds before quietly speaking. I should have listened to Mom. Walter nodded once but said nothing. That hurt Richard more than anger would have. Outside the courthouse, dusk settled early across the town square. Christmas lights reflected softly against dirty snowbanks while pickup trucks rolled carefully through frozen intersections. Walter and Eli stopped at Miller Feed and Grain on the drive home. The crooked auction notice still hung beside the coffee machine. Only now someone had written across it in black marker. Sale voided. Eli watched customers pretending not to stare as Walter poured coffee into his thermos like any ordinary evening. Nothing about him suggested victory. No satisfaction. No celebration. Just quiet completion. Back at the farm, the western pasture rested untouched beneath fresh snow. Prairie Meridian's equipment was gone. Only faint tire marks remained where the drilling rigs once stood. Walter stood beside the fence line with Eli as wind moved across the empty acreage. "You knew they'd underestimate you," Eli said. Walter adjusted his gloves slowly. "No," he replied. "I knew they'd underestimate paper." From his coat pocket, he removed the folded 1974 document one last time. The edges had softened with age, but Rose Harper's signature remained sharp beneath the county seal. Walter looked at it briefly before handing it to Eli. "Keep records," he said quietly. Then the old farmer walked back toward the house where the tea kettle had already begun to whistle again.